Hello, welcome to MTO Sociology. This video is concerning the families part of paper 1. We're going to be looking at the different sociological studies you need to know for this part of the paper. The idea here being to get the most marks possible, not just across the paper, but across the essay sections in particular. Therefore, we're only going to focus on the studies relevant to the families part of paper 1. The first study we're going to look at is from the feminist perspective. It was written in 1992 and it's by Delphy and Leonard. So as you can see from the extract here, Delphy and Leonard are radical feminists and they obviously see the family as exploitative, particularly the nuclear family, and capitalism is the other system which exploits women. So it's the roles within the family and the fact that those roles are used to support capitalism. So your keywords here are dual burden, domestic labour, patriarchy, those kind of ideas. And you'll see that obviously Delphy and Leonard concern themselves with how men benefit and women are exploited. So if you ever use them in an essay, you may want to use Oakley or Zaretsky to back up this point of view. And obviously the functionists are the big opposite view in terms of their views around socialisation and particularly the benefits of the nuclear family. So Parsons, Durkheim and Willmott and Young all have a role to play. So any essay, particularly in the family section, I can see Delphy and Leonard being fairly easy to use. Anything on family types, the nuclear family, domestic labour, all of the stuff in the blue box at the bottom, and anything else you can think of, they're going to be really handy to bring up. The second feminist study comes from Oakley. It's an incredibly famous study. It was from 1982, so it's a decade before Delphy and Leonard. So just remember that if you're going to talk about where they came in terms of sociology. Oakley looked at the idea around the traditional nuclear family. Now when Oakley was writing, the nuclear family was a married couple with kids. Obviously things have changed since then, so that's something that you can use in the essay to critique Oakley. She talks about the impact of housework and how women end up always doing a greater share, even if they go out to work. And what you can see here is how the traditional nuclear family, something which is recently making a comeback in the headlines, really influenced Oakley's work and her experience of it. So again, Delphy, Leonard and Zaretsky can be used in an essay combined with Oakley to argue a certain point of view, a conflict point of view. And the functionalist views of Parsons, Durkheim, Willmott and Young are going to counter those more often than not. So you can see with Oakley as well, she's still active. She was interviewed recently and she was talking about how proud she was of this study and why it's so important. So it's a very, very famous sociological study. Talcott Parsons is probably the most famous of the functionalists, or the easy to remember, I would say, the functionalist perspectives. Notice he's writing right at the end of the 50s. So it's the era of that traditional nuclear family that we've looked at. And immediately after he's written this, there's a decade of change in the 60s and society changes, particularly in Britain. So he looks at the idea of segregated conjugal roles being really relevant and the idea of the breadwinner and housewife. Any essays you get on the benefits of the nuclear family or the negatives, obviously you can use Parsons along with Durkheim to argue the functionalist perspective and why they favour the nuclear family. Again, very clearly they're going to go against the writings of Oakley, Zaretsky, and to an extent Willmott and Young. So you can take two functionalists there and talk about how Parsons was superseded by Willmott and Young, who was writing later, and Willmott and Young noticed that change but kept it as a functionalist perspective. Rapoport and Rapoport, writing in 1982, just like Oakley. It's hard to know where to put this husband and wife in terms of perspectives. You could say that they kind of agree with Willmott and Young because they're mapping the changes in the organisation to the family types in Britain, but therefore do they disagree with everyone else? It's a hard one to say. What they're really useful for, any essay on family diversity, on changes, on stereotypes, all the stuff below in the blue box. Theirs was a really large scale study. They showed how family types reflect all these different factors. So if you think of your cages, you can then think of Rapoport and Rapoport there, and how families go through cycles and you're born into one family and then your role will change as you grow up and have your own family. So things like culture, class, gender, all of those things will affect how you experience the family. And Rapoport really nail that in their study here. So use it for anything to do with change and diversity in an essay. Young and Willmott, or Willmott and Young, functionalists from the 1970s. They take the traditional functionalist view and show that it's changing amongst the middle class in Britain. So they talk of this idea of symmetrical families, shared conjugal roles. And it's really important because it shows that sociological perspectives aren't necessarily fixed, particularly here with functionalism. So you can use it for that, alongside Rapoport and Rapoport, contrast it with Parsons, and look at the conflict sociologists, particularly when it comes to feminism and gender roles here. One big criticism, though, is how wide scale this study was, and the fact that it kind of dealt with well-to-do, middle-class, probably majority white London couples. It wasn't representative of Britain as a whole, maybe. So it's a really interesting study because it can show some real benefits and help you show the examiner you really understand that these ideas aren't fixed, but it does have weaknesses too. So if you can recognise that, that will really, really boost up your marks. Zaretsky is kind of the standalone Marxist, really. The model of the cushion is the thing most people associate with Zaretsky. Writing at a similar time to Young and Willmott, 1976, he looks at the family totally through the lens of Marxism and how it's built to benefit capitalism. The nuclear family, stresses out the male breadwinner, and the family provides a haven from that. So it's kind of similar in some respects to the warm bath theory from functionalism, but it has negative connotations rather than positive. So he looks at society being encouraged to be consumers. So here we see the dawn of the teenager, the dawn of advertising for maybe, things like vacuum cleaners or cleaning products aimed specifically at women, and perhaps maybe cars or golf or something else specifically aimed at the man of the house. And what Zaretsky's really getting at here is that the gender roles in the house are reflected in the media and vice versa, and this encourages people to exploit their own families, as it were, to live up to certain roles and to keep being exploited by capitalism. Really, really useful for obviously other conflict sociologists with Oakley, Delphy and Leonard, and challenging the Marxist view that the nuclear family is a positive thing. So you should be able to see Zaretsky. You may not write a whole essay around Zaretsky, or may not even use half an essay on Zaretsky. It may be, unless you get a specific question on capitalism and the family, Zaretsky's more someone you add in as a third voice or to back up a point that you use. So those are the studies to do with paper 1 and families. It's an area of the exam where students really do very well on generally, not necessarily because it's particularly easy, but because the material is very interesting and very useful for applying to ourselves. Remember, obviously, you have functionalists on one side, conflict sociologists and feminists and Marxists on the other side, and Rapoport kind of sitting in the middle, as it were. Always use the studies that are most easy for you to explain in your own words. Remember, you will get questions on studies earlier in the paper, so in the essay part you can refer back to those if they're relevant. One last thing you may want to look at is things like the methods they used, if you know that. So if you know, for example, whether a sociologist used secondary methods or primary methods, you can reflect that if you need to in an essay, as this is why it's a good study or this is why it's a poor study. But don't dwell on that in an essay. Maybe only use that for the shorter questions specifically about that one particular study. As always, any comments, any questions, please let me know. Leave them on the video, in the Google Classroom. Come and see me at school. Thank you very much.